Hey YouTube, in this video I'm going to be talking about how to handle disappointment during your season or any point during your season and the right way to deal with it so you can actually continue to improve. Because throughout the entirety of your career there will be many points in time where you're disappointed with the outcome of what you do. You can be disappointed for a variety of reasons. Maybe your times were dramatically slower than your personal best. Maybe you realized by the end of the season you peaked early, you peaked in your first few races, so you spent the entire season trying to chase your PB. Maybe you got closer but you never beat the PB. Could be try to get a PB that you never achieved. This is generally not so much of a problem. This one just isn't usually a cause for disappointment because you're still PBing, but it's just not as much as you want. A good example of this would be when Usain Bolt ran, I believe it was in the Olympics for 2012. He tried to beat the world record again of his 1919 and he failed. He didn't get PB, but he was disappointed for two reasons. First of all, he never broke his world record. Second of all, he wasn't close enough to his PB to even try to consider breaking it. But throughout the entirety of your seasons, as you progress as a sprinter and just as an athlete in general, you will experience disappointment. But it's important to understand that disappointment is useful, because if you're disappointed, that means something went wrong, and now you know what went wrong, as long as you really think over the whole thing, so you're able to make sure this doesn't happen again. And even though you might be disappointed, it's always good to look at what went well, because these what went wells will help spur you on to perform even better than you already have. Because if you stay disappointed and you let this become something that clouds you, when you go into your next race, you're going to be thinking about this disappointment. And you'll go in with the headspace of, okay, I need to make sure that this mistake that I had doesn't happen again. Obviously, that's a good mindset to have. But you might go in thinking, okay, this might just be me now. This just might be me. I might just be disappointing, and this can affect how you sprint. So it's important that when disappointment happens, you accept it's going to happen. There's most likely in every season you're going to have one disappointing race at least. So just accept it and learn from that race, because generally it's usually the most disappointing races that you have that you can learn the most from. I know from experience that all of the races that I've been the most disappointed in have always been races where I learned the most, and they helped me to improve dramatically. And when I say dramatically, I mean dramatically. It's the races where I did well, where I was too focused on how well I did, to the point where I never really looked at how bad my races actually were. I was just lucky, especially if you go in a race where, for example, you run it and you win. Because in races where you run a race and you win, especially in races where you PB and you win, it's especially easy to not be disappointed at all, because you've not only PB but you won. But if you actually look at the race, if you've had it recorded and look at the entire thing, you might realize, okay, I could have worked on that, I could have worked on that, I could have worked on that, just like how your coach would. And you just get told that essentially the entire thing is a disappointment, which is good, because if the entire thing is a disappointment, that means you still have room to improve. And if you still have room to improve, that means your time can drop even more. But if you're running your races and you've noticed that your times are much slower than your PBs, this has suddenly happened, you might have peaked. But if you have peaked, then you know for sure that next season you know what to not do to ensure you don't peak, because you need to go over your other races and how you've been training so far and realize, okay, have I peaked? Have I not peaked? Have I peaked? And just get it out of the way. No, so for next season you can perform better. And if it's just you just got a slow time, then you can think about what actually caused this slow time. For example, maybe your splits were just weird. Maybe your if you're running 100, maybe your first 50 was somehow faster than your second 50, or same for your 200 or your 400. Maybe you didn't pace yourself properly. There's so many different factors that could be affecting how the race ended up, which you would know yourself, that are worth noting, so that you can actually try and make sure this disappointment only happens once. Because you're gonna, like I said before, you are gonna face disappointment as an athlete, but you only need to face disappointment in a specific direction once. So for example, unless you're trying to be an overachiever, you're only really gonna, and like for example, trying to PB by crazy amounts, you're only really gonna face disappointment in one area that you can possibly get disappointment once. For example, you might have only one race that is dramatically bad, because once you've had that race, as long as you fall over, you'll be able to make sure that never happens again. So you might have a bad race, but it won't be to the point where it's like what just happened. You know, you might only ever have that happen once. Another thing worth noting is, if you get disappointed, think about why you were disappointed. For example, my last race, I was disappointed because I experimented. This experiment was necessary because it showed me how I need to run my races for the 200. But the disappointment was necessary, and it made it so that I will never get disappointed in this direction again, because I know the way I run my 200s is perfect, essentially, because the only other way I could run it didn't work for me. So the way I'm running it, unless there's some way I haven't thought of, this is the way I'm going to continue running my 200s. So now I know this disappointment I faced, I'm only going to ever face it once. It doesn't ever have to happen again. But it is probably most likely the same for you, especially if you're experimenting, because it's important to experiment as soon as possible. Like anything you could think of on how you could potentially run your races, it's good to experiment, because sometimes these experiments will go right, sometimes these experiments will go wrong. But regardless of if it's right or wrong, you learn something new. If they went right, then you know what to add into your races. If they went wrong, then you know what to make sure never ever occurs in your races. And either way you go, it might give you room for another experiment which might be able to make you faster. Because every single time I generally get faster, it's always by me experimenting. Sometimes I face disappointment, that's just life. There's no way a scientist is gonna do an experiment, make a hypothesis and everything, and the theory that they have for how the experiment is going to go is going to be exactly how they thought it was. That doesn't happen all the time. It's not going to happen on track either. But when you are disappointed, make sure that you always just think about why you're disappointed, and you don't let it affect you, because if this affects you, then it could ruin the rest of your season. And the earlier the disappointment is, then the more annoyed you're going to be. For example, in this season alone, I've faced, off the top of my head, 2 disappointments that I can think of. And the very first disappointment I faced was my very first race of the season, I believe it was. It was a 200 meter. So yeah, and the other one was a 200 meter as well. But it was for different reasons why I was disappointed. The first 200 meter, I was disappointed because I ran the race and I stepped over the line. I never got called back for it. The time was legal. And I also PB'd as well, and I won the race, but I was disappointed because I stepped over the line. I could have gone much faster, and because of that I slowed down. So that's one time I was disappointed. But now I know, because this happened in indoors, I know, okay, I need to make sure that when I go around that bend, I just float, I relax, I chill, and then I can properly start to sprint as I get to the straight, so that I won't try and fall off of the curve as I'm coming out. And then for the 200, I ran it way too hard, and so I got a really fast 100 meter around the bend. In fact, it was a crazy PB by about 0.6 to 7 seconds. 0.6 to 0.7 seconds off my 100 meter time, and the final 100 was really poor. But now I know the way I ran that 200, I should never run it for outdoors ever again, because it doesn't work. For the indoors, it didn't really work out. In fact, I didn't even run my indoor that hard either. So now I know 2 things that I was able to learn that will affect me next season for my indoors, and this season and the rest of the seasons for my outdoors. And because of that, whilst I face a disappointment, I'm able to improve and make sure that my times continue to improve. And it should be the same for you. Make sure that when you get disappointing races, you don't just take it at face value. There's always something to look at. Because my 200 meter, where I ran a really slow time, the 200 where I went basically all out, I originally didn't want to look at the race because I was like, it's very bad. But I looked at the race because I remember how it felt. The first 100 was really fast and the second 100 wasn't. I looked at the race and I saw the PB that I technically got on the bend. And I'm like, if I can get that time on a straight for 100, that would be great. But if I didn't look at that, I wouldn't have known how fast I was going, because I made a lot of changes in my technique which allowed me to do that. And I wouldn't have been able to really understand the fruits of my labor if I didn't look. So I might have ended up not looking and then end up changing my technique for block starts, which I worked really hard on, and how I pushed out, which could have affected me for this season and the next seasons, because I might have ended up doing something that isn't as efficient as what I did in the 200 that I ran. Whilst it was my slowest 200 of the season so far, I learned a lot from it, and it was really fast. The entire thing wasn't really fast. And it's the same thing for you. Disappointment is just a time to learn. Failure is just an opportunity for you to learn. If you don't learn from failure, then not only is that failure now an actual failure, because before it was just a moment for learning, but now you're not going to gain anything from it. You failed for no reason. There's no point in failing if you don't learn from it. Because if you don't learn from it, you can't make sure it doesn't happen again. And if you can't make sure it doesn't happen again, there's a good chance that the next time you're gonna face the same thing. This is why people, they run a lot of disappointing races, why they get injured a lot. They don't actually realize that once they've failed, they face disappointment. They don't realize why they have, and they don't try to fix it. If you don't try to just accept it, remove your ego, look at the disappointment, try and learn from it, and try and make sure it never happens again, it's gonna happen again whether you like it or not. If you like my video, like the video, let me know in the comments section below. Check the description, because anything I forget to say in the video, I always put in the description. And if you like my content, subscribe, helps the channel out a lot. I post every 2 days at 1 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. If you don't know when that is, just hit the bell and then you'll be notified instantly.